When people imagine the fall of Rome, they imagine barbarians breaking down the gates, legions disappearing, or emperors being poisoned in palaces. However, empires do not fall only because of outside attacks. They rot from within, and one of the most destructive forces is money. Rome did not fall only because of attacks and corruption. It fell because of the management of its currency. And the lessons of this collapse apply to all world economies that think they can manage money and escape the wrong consequences. Let's make this clear. For centuries, Rome's economic backbone was the silver denarius. It started being produced around 201 BC and was generally made of pure silver. It was trusted and valued both inside and outside the empire. Roman soldiers were paid with this money. Merchants demanded this money, and people stored their savings and wealth in the form of the silver denarius. The denarius was not just money, it was trust in metal form. The power of the empire and the power of money were almost the same. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in the denarius. However, managing a large empire is expensive. Soldiers had to be paid, roads and aqueducts had to be built, and wars had to be financed. By the 2nd century AD, Rome was struggling heavily to defend its borders against Germanic tribes, Parthians in the east, and internal unrest. Tax revenues were not enough to cover military costs. So emperors turned to an old method, debasement. Instead of increasing taxes on citizens, they reduced the silver content in the denarius. The power of money and numbers tells the story. During Emperor Augustus' time, the denarius was about 95% silver. By the early 3rd century under Caracalla, it dropped to about 50%. By Emperor Gallienus, it dropped below 5%. A coin that was once pure silver turned into a bronze disc with a silver appearance. People could see and feel this difference. Inflation appeared. Since money was no longer tied to pure silver value, prices increased. A measure of wheat that once cost 1 denarius began to cost hundreds of denarii. This was not an abstract theory. It destroyed the lives of ordinary people. Soldiers demanded higher wages to meet their needs. Merchants stopped accepting this devalued money and turned to barter or gold. Local economies turned to barter because money had lost its value. As trust in emperors decreased, they started printing even more money, trying to compensate value with quantity. This was a vicious cycle, a cycle that has repeated many times throughout history in inflation crises. The crisis reached its peak during the crisis of the 3rd century between 235 to 284 AD. Rome experienced nearly 50 years of chaos, invasions, attacks, civil and external wars, and economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell quickly, some lasting only a few months. Behind this political and economic chaos was a broken financial system. Taxes were demanded in increasingly worthless money. Farmers abandoned their lands because they could not pay taxes. Trade routes collapsed, and the Roman government tried methods such as price controls and forced labor to keep things going. None of them worked. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing the prices of thousands of goods and services. Those who did not follow the rule were punished with death. However, since money had already become worthless, prices could not be controlled by decree. The black market collapsed and official trade ended. Eventually, Rome completely abandoned the denarius. In 312 AD, Constantine the Great introduced a gold-based currency called the solidus. This brought stability and was used for centuries in the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire. However, by that time, the Western Roman Empire had already experienced deep collapse. The end of the denarius had destroyed the economic center of Rome. Armies became uncontrollable. Trade networks collapsed and trust disappeared. The fall of Rome was not a single event, but a long process of breakdown. Currency collapse was one of its most dangerous factors. What does this mean for today? Economy is always the destruction of empires. Rome thought it could deceive its people. It introduced a currency that looked the same but had less value. Modern governments think they can do the same by printing paper money, manipulating interest rates, or reducing debt through inflation. But the result is always the same. People pay the price, wealth disappears, and trust ends. Rome learned this lesson the hard way. If we ignore this situation, we will experience the same collapse. History did not stop teaching after Rome. Every major inflation crisis has repeated in a similar way. Governments reduce the value of money to cover losses, wealthy people protect themselves with savings, and ordinary people become poor. The Roman currency crisis is one of the first examples of this cycle. Let's move to the 20th century. After World War I, Germany faced heavy reparations due to the Treaty of Versailles. The government began printing money to cover its debts. By 1923, hyperinflation had gone out of control. A loaf of bread, which cost 1 mark before the war, reached 200 billion marks by the end of the year. People carried their wages in wheelbarrows. And just like in Rome, while indebted people collapsed due to inflation, the wealthy gained power. Money lost its value, and economic collapse paved the way for political extremism and the rise of Hitler. Zimbabwe followed the same path. In the early 2000s, production decreased, debts increased, and the government started printing money again. In 2008, inflation reached unimaginable levels. Prices increased every day. Eventually, the country abandoned its own currency and switched to the US dollar and the South African rand. The same scenario repeated. Governments thought they could hide reality, but the people paid the price again. But we don't always need to look at extreme examples. Even in modern developed economies, the Roman pattern exists. In 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. From that day, the dollar became a currency based not on gold but on trust in the government. In the following years, debt increased, money supply expanded, and inflation became constant. What could be bought for $1 in 1971 now costs more than $5 to $6. Governments present inflation as growth. They present debt as investment. They present the stock market as wealth, although many people do not actually own shares or guarantees. Just like in Rome, nothing seems to change on the surface, but the currency slowly loses value. Today, the danger is greater because the system is global. Rome was an imperial crisis. Germany was a national crisis. Zimbabwe was local. But today, the entire world is tied to a monetary system, huge debts, and central banks that print money in crises. This means any possible crisis will not stay in one country. It will spread worldwide. And if we look at history, those who will suffer are not the rich, but people who save money from salaries or depend on pensions thinking they are safe. So what lesson should you take as an adult? 1. Inflation is not an accident, it is a policy. 2. Real wealth is not what is written on paper or shown on a screen, but value-preserving assets. 3. Do not rely on your savings alone to protect you. People in Rome never believed their money would lose value. Germans in 1913 would have laughed at the idea. Zimbabweans thought independence would bring prosperity. But all of them collapsed in similar ways due to crises. The fall of Rome shows us this. Financial systems collapse slowly when trust disappears, but the collapse happens suddenly. When money stops being real, society begins to fall apart. Contracts break, trade stops, armies dissolve, and governments lose legitimacy. But the real destruction always comes from the treasury. And the final sentence. History does not repeat itself, but if you do not know history, it will destroy you. The Roman currency crisis was not just about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about the fragility of money when abused by power. If this gave you a different perspective, subscribe to the channel. History informs you.